Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our seminar, Two Bedford Row Sports, Discrimination in Football, where the speakers are myself, Chris Saad, but the one that you're most interested in hearing from, Jimmy Floyd Hasselbaink, who's with us tonight as well. Our Chambers has done a lot of work in sport over the years, and not just in football, but in rugby, cricket, tennis, boxing. We were in Bloodgate, horse race fixing, Webster on Article 17, and most recently, Mark Milliken-Smith had a glorious victory in a cricket corruption case, allowing Gunawardena to play again. What we're going to deal with tonight, and what we are delighted so many of you have joined us to discuss, is, we think, the biggest issue in football today. And thank you for Jimmy coming tonight. Jimmy is, of course, well known to those of you who are football fans, and in his glittering career at the highest level, with amongst other clubs, Leeds, Middlesbrough, Atletico Madrid, and Chelsea, he scored 195 goals in 468 club games, and that gets to be an even higher statistic if you exclude his early years in Holland. He scored 190 in 420 games, so very close to the Holy Grail of 1 every 2 games. He won the Premier League Golden Boot, and he is currently the manager of Burton Albion and an instantly recognisable Sky Sports television pundit. Welcome, Jimmy.
Thank you.
The webinar tonight is going to fall into 3 parts. Firstly, a discussion about social media, the abuse of players, and how the law can be used to stop it. Secondly, how the FA deals with participants who are charged with aggravated breaches of their rules. That is a rule breach with the aggravating element of discrimination. And the Q&A with Jimmy at the end. Please type your questions into the bar and we will select some to put to Jimmy at the end. The slides, of course, will be available to any of you who want them afterwards. The abuse that's now spouted on social media platforms is a depressing and disgusting commonplace phenomenon. It seems to have been with us forever, but whilst preparing for this seminar and reading up on some of the awful material posted recently, my mind went back nearly 20 years to 2004, and the first ever case where a football club was charged with failing to ensure their fans did not engage in racist conduct. In that case, I acted for the defence of Millwall. The allegation related to crowd disorder in a cup game between Millwall and Liverpool at the Den. The incident lasted 12 seconds in the 68th minute, and the club relied on the fact that it was so short-lived because in those days they had the defence available to them of due diligence. In the course of preparing that case, I had the privilege of working closely with Ken Chapman, and welcome to his successor, John Darcy, who's on the call tonight. Ken was a man of impeccable integrity who worked as hard as anybody could, unstintingly for years, to try to improve Millwall's reputation, tilting at windmills indeed in those early days. But he didn't just set out to catch and bar miscreants, although of course he did that. He was deeply committed to educating the fans and creating a changed culture in the ground that racist abuse was unacceptable. Millwall set up a family enclosure, which many people mocked at the time. But again, at least one of the people on here today takes his children to the family enclosure at the New Den. He was the first person I ever heard use the phrase web warrior for people who sit in darkened rooms and abuse people or plan fights. Why do people feel able to write down and send disgusting messages that they would, we hope, never say to any individual's face? There have been campaigns, there have been calls to action, and big names have quit social media for good, but the discriminatory abuse continues. And not a single match day goes by without more reports of a footballer being abused. Some of the abusers use false names and are hard to trace, but many just use their own names and are easily identified. Since the beginning of this season, enforcement has stepped up as a result of campaigns put on by players. After the Spurs-Man United game on the 11th of April, Heung-min Son was abused, and the Premier League and Manchester United took action and quickly traced the authors of the abuse insofar as they could find people who used their own names. By the end of April, 6 Manchester United supporters had been banned. 3 of them were season ticket holders, 2 were members, and the 6th was on the waiting list for a season ticket. United can take that action, but what is staggering is nobody gets prosecuted. You can count on the fingers of one hand the prosecution of people for this sort of abuse. And social media platforms can act, because in what cannot be coincidental timing, Instagram launched a new tool the day after the recent Premier League boycott to identify and remove racist abuse. Obviously, due diligence up until now is something that the social media platforms have fallen down on. And a cynic might believe that it was only because high-profile names are now leaving social media platforms that they've done anything about it. Manchester United, in a recent survey, said that since September 2019, there's been a 350% increase in online abuse directed towards its players, with more than 3,000 posts targeting players during the period September 19 to February 21. 86% of those posts were racist, 8% were homophobic or transphobic. The PFA, and again, we're delighted that they've also joined us this evening, found 56 abusive posts on Twitter in November 2020. The PFA reported them. 31 of them were still visible last month, 6 months later. A BBC Sports survey in August 2020 of elite British sportswomen found that 1/3 of them had suffered abuse on social media. And you will have all read over the last 2 weeks Karen Carney's description of the daily abuse she is subject to. The call for new law is no more, we say, than grandstanding, being seen to do something rather than giving the police the resources to use existing law or taking on big tech. And whilst we welcome the greater regulation of the internet that will follow from the online safety bill, there is something that can be done now. Social media platforms should enforce their terms and conditions. Why not insist on identity being provided to establish an account with a real-life consequence for abuse? William shouldn't be afraid to turn on his phone because of abuse at him and his family, and Anthony Marshall should not be receiving death threats. Jimmy, you played at a time when social media was only just coming to the fore. Is it much worse now than when you were playing?
Oh, so much worse, so much worse. There's so much more access. People see it a lot more. Everybody's on it. It's on every device now. If you're not on it, you know, you're not really cool. So, and everybody reads it, So that's why, you know, it's so important that we really put a stop to it, because it is really widespread, you know, and everybody reads it, and all the individual that gets that kind of abuse, you know, we don't really, the majority of us don't really think about them, how it affects them personally, you know, and that is really the worst thing about it, how it affects somebody personally, you know. We should do a lot better, Jim, a lot better.
Can I pass you over to Chris Saad, who will discuss the criminal and FA regulatory offences that relate to discrimination?
Thanks, Jim, and good evening, everyone. I'm going to speak to you about the offences within the Football Association, but I'm going to start by talking through some of the criminal offences in this area, because there are many public statements about the online abuse we are seeing reported every week, and the words used are, you know, abhorrent, vile, and disgusting, and all of those are, of course, perfectly true. But the other word that is quite often missing in the discussion is criminal. Communications sent via social media can involve a range of existing offences, whether that be offences against the person, public justice, sexual offences, or public order offences. I'm going to first look at the Malicious Communications Act of 1988 and the Communications Act of 2003. This slide sets out in full Section 1 of the Malicious Communications Act. And as you can see, the offence relates to electronic communications, and so would obviously include communications over social media, but also letters and articles of any description. And it relates to messaging that's either indecent or grossly offensive, a threat, or information that's false and known or believed to be false by the sender, or indeed any article or electronic communication of an indecent or grossly offensive nature, which racist abuse clearly is. The extra ingredient to this offence relates to the purpose, or one of the purposes the sender had when sending the message, which is to cause the recipient or intended recipient distress or anxiety. The sentence for this offence can be up to 2 years imprisonment if tried in the Crown Court, and/or a fine which can be unlimited. Next then, Section 127 of the Communications Act. The first point to note here is that these offences relate only to the sending of messages over a public electronic communications network. Again, obviously that includes social media platforms, but it wouldn't include messaging that's, for example, on Bluetooth between one device or another, nor would it include messaging over an intranet. As you can see from the slide, there are 2 subsections within Section 127. In terms of subsection 1, you'll see it shares some of its ingredients with the Malicious Communications Act. We see words again such as indecent, grossly offensive, and so on. But this offence doesn't require proving the purpose for which the sender conveyed the message. So less hurdles to clear here when seeking to prove this offence. In terms of subsection 2, that does relate to what purpose the sender had when conveying the message, but relates to the content being false as opposed to offensive or indecent. Whilst these offences may, on the face of it, be easier to prove, they have a lesser sentence to the one we looked at before. Here it's 6 months imprisonment and/or a fine not exceeding £5,000. Some of you may be aware that there is a trial pending against an individual for sending an offensive message to Romain Sawyer, the West Bromwich Albion player. The prosecution, we believe, is being brought under Section 127, and the trial is listed for September. As I said earlier on, there are other possible offences that can be considered. I'm just going to deal with the Public Order Act offences here. Section 4A, for example, is an offence when an individual intentionally causes a person harassment, alarm, or distress, where the person uses threatening, abusive, or insulting words or behaviour, or disorderly behaviour, or displays any writing, sign, or other visible representation which is threatening, abusive, or insulting, and thereby causing that person harassment, alarm, or distress, or indeed any other person. Again, that would include posts on social media, but you'll have also seen reports last weekend of Birmingham City fans, or so-called fans, putting a banner up in Blackburn ahead of their match containing racist abuse targeted at the owner of Birmingham City. That behaviour would also be caught by this legislation, and Lancashire Police indeed have confirmed that an investigation is ongoing. The sentence would normally be a maximum of 6 months imprisonment and a maximum of a £5,000 fine, but the Crime and Disorder Act of 1998 can convert effectively this offence into a racially aggravated offence. And if that's proven, the sentences increase to a maximum of 2 years imprisonment and an unlimited fine if tried in the Crown Court. There is, however, very likely to be change in this area. The Law Commission are proposing a new offence to replace the Malicious Communications Act and the Communications Act offences. They would include emails, social media posts, WhatsApp messages, pile-on harassment, and communication over private networks such as Bluetooth or the intranet not covered by the 2003 Act, as we saw earlier. But what then of the social media companies themselves? Well, last month, Facebook announced its content moderation tool designed to reduce harassment by allowing users to limit who their commenting audience can be, or by filtering direct message requests from people they don't follow if the messages contain offensive words, phrases, or emojis. Crucially, the online safety bill, the draft published only yesterday, will impose a duty on social media companies to identify and remove harmful content. The sanctions would be fines of up to £18 million or 10% of global annual turnover, whichever is the higher. An article in the Times yesterday stated that a fine of 10% of global turnover would mean £6 billion for Facebook and £13 billion for Google. The communications regulator, Ofcom, will be appointed to oversee and enforce the new measures. And in addition to those financial penalties, they will also have the power to impose business disruption measures, including, for egregious failures, blocking services from being accessed in the UK. The draft bill has included a deferred power for the Secretary of State to introduce criminal offences where senior managers fail to comply with information requests from Ofcom. Moving on now to the regulatory offences that there are in football. Rule E3, as set out there, will be familiar to many of you. And as you can see, it provides that participants shall at all times act in the best interests of the game and shall not act in a manner which is improper or brings the game into disrepute through their behaviour. The aggravated breach is provided in Rule E3.2, which says that a breach is aggravated where the offence includes a reference, whether express or implied, to any one or more of the characteristics listed on the slide. For the current season, the FA brought in a new sanctioning regime, which means that if a breach is proven, the participant will receive a sanction of between 6 and 12 matches, and 6 matches being what's described as the standard minimum. Where a number of aggravating features are present, there can be a penalty of more than 12 matches. But what are those aggravating features? They can include a number of things: the repeated use of discriminatory language or conduct during the commission of the offence, the public nature of the offence, whether the participant holds a position of responsibility, club captain, chairman, senior management, for example, and any attempt to conceal the breach. And that's an interesting one, given the recent phenomenon of players covering their mouths when speaking. So the standard minimum of 6 matches. UEFA's minimum is 10 matches. As you'll have seen in the Kudela case, the Slavia Prague player who has been found to have used racist language in a European game against Rangers in March. There are, of course, exceptions to the standard minimum, and that occurs when, as we see from this slide, when the offence was committed in writing only or via the use of any communication device, and where the Regulatory Commission is satisfied there was no genuine intent on the part of the participant charged to be discriminatory or offensive in any way, and could not have reasonably known that any such offence would be caused. If a participant can persuade a Regulatory Commission that the breach falls into that category, the suspension can be of no less than 3 matches, provided the Commission feel that's the just outcome in all of the circumstances. So if a participant does on the face of it fall within the exception, that doesn't mean the minimum is automatically reduced to 3, but it means it can be, depending on the Commission's view of the case as a whole. Finally, from me, a case review of the case, the Cavani case. It's an interesting one because it was the first matter that involved an aggravated breach this season. And secondly, because the Commission did feel that Mr. Cavani fell into the exception we've just been through. The facts of the case will be well known to many of you. On Instagram, and in response to an old friend posting about Cavani's 2 goals in United's comeback against Southampton, Cavani posted "Gracias Negrito." The Commission received evidence from an expert, Professor David Wood, who is an expert in Latin American studies. And as you can see from the slide, his view was that the term is commonly used in South America without offence being intended. It's often used as a term of affection, as between friends. But he did note, perhaps unsurprisingly, that for English native speakers unfamiliar with South American culture, they would take offence to the words used. The Commission concluded that there was no intent on the part of the player to be discriminatory in any way, and it took the view that Cavani's post was a reply in affectionate appreciation of a message from his Uruguayan friend, and that it was not designed or intended to be racist or offensive either to his friend or to anyone else. And so, having made that finding, they considered whether Mr. Cavani fell into the exception from the standard minimum 6-match ban. And they considered that he did, and they took into account the relatively small amount of time he had spent in this jurisdiction, and so not recognising that a term used in his native language as being affectionate and unoffensive was unquestionably offensive in this country, and that the player had received no media training upon his arrival into the country, and the Commission expressed surprise that the player had had no such training put in place by his club. Finally, they considered that looking at the case as a whole, the just outcome was for the exception to the standard minimum to apply. They said the context and background of how this player came to say what he did were of a kind that would have resulted in a disproportionately unfair length of sanction if the standard minimum had been applied of 6 matches. And it's just worth reiterating that it would have been 6 matches regardless if it was something that wasn't said either in writing or via a communication device, because it's only in those circumstances that the Commission can even begin to consider the exception to the standard minimum. And you'll may be aware of the case of Jan Songu, the Morecambe player who used a homophobic term against an opponent on the pitch. And he addressed the Commission in similar terms to the way in which Mr. Cavani did, but there could be no consideration of the exception, and he received the 6-game minimum ban. But the sanction in Mr. Cavani's case, as you see there, was the 3-match ban, which is the lowest it can possibly be, even if you fall into the exception, £100,000 fine, and the mandatory face-to-face education programme. What we're going to do now, before I hand back over to Jim, is just run a poll for you to see whether or not you feel that the decision in the Cavani case was correct. So the question will be, was the sanction in the Cavani case fair? And the options will be fair, too harsh, or too lenient. So I'll launch that poll now and give you a moment or two to cast your vote. And I'll end the poll there. Fairly split, 60% fair. I'll share the results, beg your pardon. 60% fair, too harsh, 30% too lenient for 11%. And we're going to do the same for a poll that Jim's going to run with his review as well. So on that note, I'll hand over to you, Jim.
The next part of my screen. The next part of the address to you is going to deal with the a season and a half ago now. But before I turn to that, taking action against the trolls using the criminal law, which Chris has just explained to you, is a matter that requires careful balance. It's very easy to say zero tolerance is justified, and it probably is at the moment. But you've got to be very careful of not driving the trolls underground. Just like the more lunatic fringes of the QAnon conspiracy have moved to 8chan or Telegram, if the racists carry on regardless on different platforms, then a long-term solution won't be found. And the public, I'm sure, would welcome the social media giants being punished in their pockets and making people provide ID to set up their accounts would be a pretty simple solution. If the police won't take action, who's going to be the player or the club to stand up first and bring a private prosecution? It's going to happen one day. But as Ken Chapman and John Barnes and many others have argued, deterrence in itself is not enough. It has to be coupled with education. And to support that observation, may I ask all of you who've not done so before, watch the truly remarkable Daryl Davis YouTube channel, which is called Clan We Talk. He shows that we can't just give up on racists and punish them, because to do so runs the risk of hardening and entrenching their attitude. Mr. Davis, over the last 30 years, has converted 300 members of the KKK and other white nationalist groups to become diverse in their mindset and to treat people equally. He has been so successful that he was even asked to give the bride away at the wedding of a former KKK imperial wizard. The word used by Mr. Cavani is, of course, almost identical to the word used 7 times by Luis Suarez to Patrice Evra in the famous Manchester United-Liverpool incident a few years ago. The big difference, of course, is that Mr. Suarez wasn't being friendly and engaging in badly judged banter, judged objectively in Mr. Cavani's case. He pinched Mr. Evra on the arm and used the word 7 times, but I suppose a pinch makes a change from the usual bite. Of course, the context and personal relationship of the two people is vital in assessing whether something is insulting in real life or ill-judged banter that crosses the line, as in Mr. Cavani's case. But of course, context is lost as soon as you write something down and put it online, as I'm sure all of you have told your children. And that's demonstrated by the Silva case. The FA prosecuted Bernardo Silva, and the facts were that Bernardo Silva posted a tweet on his personal Twitter account, an account that had 600,000 followers. The tweet was directed to his teammate and good friend, Benjamin Mendy. The tweet showed a picture of the player's Manchester City teammate as a child, juxtaposed with an image of a cartoon character used to promote a brand of Spanish chocolate called Conguitos. The player accompanied the photograph with the question, "Guess who?" and 2 laughing emojis. He took the tweet down within 45 minutes. The FA researched the matter and noted, in the words of the commission in their judgment, that there was some controversy regarding the Conguitos character, which had been used for many years. The FA argued that the conduct was aggravated in 4 different ways. 1, whilst the player had no knowledge of the historical connotations of the character, he, quote, ought properly to have been aware that such stereotyping as is contained in the image as insulting or improper by reference to race, colour and/or ethnic origin, that the imagery may have had a particularly bad influence upon young children, and by reason of his age and experience as an international footballer, he ought to have had a greater awareness regarding the implications of posting such an image on social media. And fourthly, that the tweet was published on a site with 600,000 followers. The player admitted the charge and made it quite plain that he was in fact unaware of the controversy, that he had grown up in a country where the brand and the character were familiar and considered inoffensive. It had been intended as a joke and had been taken as a joke by Mr. Mendy. And Mr. Mendy wrote a letter setting out the fact that he did indeed take it as a joke. But whilst Mr. Silva was ignorant of the historical connotations and had not intended the post to be offensive, he nevertheless acknowledged that it was. Mr. Silva was sentenced by the commission, who found that the aggravating features were as follows: that previously decided cases observed correctly that a high-profile professional footballer may have his misconduct aggravated by reason of the fact that his profile in the community serves to further influence those exposed to the improper communication. Moreover, in this particular case, the offending material was distributed to an extensive public audience. The commission regard that degree of publicity, coupled with the profile of this well-respected professional footballer, as being an aggravating factor. The mitigation was set out after the aggravation. The mitigating factors were 5. Set out there: lack of knowledge, not intended to be racist and promptly deleted. Thereafter given the opportunity and to have a greater understanding of his responsibilities on social media. The player made an early admission in cooperation and he had an exemplary record. The punishment imposed upon him by the commission was a 1-match ban, a £50,000 fine, and a mandatory face-to-face education program. That would now be a mandatory 3-game ban. But again, I think Chris is going to put up a poll asking the same question as we did in relation to Mr. Cavani, as to whether or not, judging by the rules as they then were in 2019, was the sanction fair, too harsh or too lenient? And again, pretty close split: 47% fair, 44% too lenient, and 9% too harsh. But that was that case is an interesting point. It illustrates that the warnings that we're all giving to our children: don't post something, even if it doesn't cause offence to the person you're posting it to, it might cause offence to others who see it. Andre Gray was a victim of that. In 2016, a Liverpool fan complained about 4-year-old social media posts in the aftermath of Andre having the cheek to score a winner against the club that the fan supported on behalf of Burnley. The fan promptly dug around the social media posts and reported Andre Gray, who was banned by the FA. Jared Bowen is currently under investigation for a post made in October 2012 when he was only 15 years old. As a result of that, the PFA and the FA have issued social media guidance to players. The FA have emphasised ignorance is not a defence, just only use words you're 100% sure you understand, making it plain that the player is responsible for what's on his account, including retweets and shares, and a warning that what you post may affect your career. The guidance also urges players to go back and check their old posts and their old tweets and to delete anything that might cross the line. There has, in fact, been one notorious survey of FA disciplinary cases. It was released in the immediate aftermath of Luis Suarez being convicted, and at a time when very few people had had the inclination or the time to read a 115-page judgment. The survey revealed how many acquittals there had been of the 473 FA regulatory cases heard between December 2010 and 2011. This is our final poll. So of those 473, how many ended in not guilty verdicts? 2, 16, 29, or 42. No cheating. If you read the survey, perhaps don't fill in the answer. Well, it was 2. So congratulations, 31%. Perhaps defending the indefensible insofar as people who defend, those of us who defend people charged with aggravated breaches, perhaps defending the indefensible should be an almost impossible task. But bear in mind, there's no variation of the sliding scale of proof required before a finding of guilt that has a terrible impact on a player's reputation. Those who defend in these cases are often left feeling uneasy. And I won't name the player, but one aggravated breach case I did within the last 4 years ended with the PFA representative sent to support the alleged victim inconsolable at the end of the case after the guilty verdict, because they were absolutely convinced of the innocence of the player who had been charged, as was I. Now, the acquittal rate has improved since more and more legally qualified chairmen have been involved since 2010, but the media often whip up a frenzy and are working on the basis the allegation is true and thereby create a desire to see punishment. Due process is rarely, if ever, discussed on sports pages. Hence, we'll see after a charge, there's often a reference to the player appealing before there's ever even been a hearing. Often the response to an acquittal that is unwelcome is a rule change. Jimmy will know that. Personal hearings for wrongful sending offs were abolished years ago, said to have been because to prevent delays in determining them, but the RFU managed to get their process convened within days or hours. But the FA's response was to make it on the papers and the video only. So come to the final case, and then we'll come to the bit that you all want, namely a Q&A with Jimmy. The final case, slide 28, please, Chris. The FA versus Patrice Evra and Chelsea Football Club, which was known at the time as Mowergate. And if you look at the picture there, poor old Patrice Evra features in this one as well, in the middle between the two Chelsea stewards in the yellow high-vis jackets. The background related to a game on the 26th of April 2008, where there was a warm-down session after the game, when a number of Manchester United players, including Patrice Evra, came out to warm down. The case against Mr. Evra was that his conduct was improper in that he pushed Jason Griffin, the head groundsman, who Jimmy would have known, struck Sam Bethel, a groundsman at Chelsea, on the side of his head, and or ran to confront Mr. Bethel, and or became involved or attempted to become involved in a physical altercation with Sam. Mr. Evra admitted A and C, but denied it was improper, and denied B and D altogether. And so we had a hearing with Mr. Evra pleading not guilty. The charges against Chelsea, and the only one I'm going to deal with, is the racially aggravated charge. And that was, in the course of the warm down, Chelsea failed to ensure that Mr. Bethel conducted himself in an orderly fashion and or refrained from any or a combination of racist and or abusive and or provocative conduct and or language. No need to consider the second charge at all. It was a hard-fought day and a half's hearing. And in the judgment, the facts and findings were set out. After the game, ground staff wished to give the playing pitch their full and immediate attention. And so Jason Griffin, the head groundsman, and his staff were already out on the pitch repairing the damage and mowing when Manchester United's fitness coach came out with 7 players for a warm-down session. In a masterpiece of understatement, the chairman said that there appeared to be slight tension and mutual irritation developing. Manchester United players were at least as responsible as the Chelsea ground staff. Gary Neville, in particular, was behaving in an abusive and provocative manner towards Chelsea ground staff. Mr. Strudwick used some of the penalty area, which was contrary to the rules, for the warm down. And after one run across the field, the Chelsea groundsman, Mr. Griffin, went up to Mr. Strudwick. Mr. Strudwick claimed that Mr. Griffin was carrying a pitchfork and his body language suggested an angry demeanor. He was instantly aggressive and was hostile and confrontational. Mr. Evra then ran over and pushed his chest into Mr. Griffin to separate Messrs. Griffin and Strudwick. Mr. Evra told Mr. Griffin to put his fork down, and it was alleged that Mr. Griffin replied, "I'll shove the effing fork up your arse." The other side of the story, which was preferred by the commission, was as follows. Mr. Griffin's case was that he asked Mr. Strudwick politely if he could use the other side of the pitch. He said that Mr. Strudwick said, "We can do what we effing like and go where we effing like." Sounds a bit like a well-known chant of Man United fans. Mr. Griffin consistently denied being aggressive or swearing, but said that the barge by Mr. Evra took him by surprise. At that point, there was an immediate reaction by others on the pitch. The United players and other staff ran over, as did the other Chelsea ground staff. There was an immediate fracas. One of the Chelsea ground staff was Mr. Bethel, and Mr. Evra said that Mr. Bethel shouted, "What do you want, Evra, you effing expletive?" Now, the second expletive is a 4-letter word that begins with a C and ends in a T, and it was not clot. And it was agreed between both parties that Mr. Bethel completely lost it and was effing and blinding and seeing through the whole thing. There was then a wider scuffle involving a number of other people, but it was Mr. Bethel and Mr. Evra who came into direct physical conflict. Mr. Griffin alleged that he saw Mr. Evra punch Bethel on the side of the head, and the panel accepted that. Mr. Bethel didn't claim it was a hard punch or that he was even hurt beyond some redness around the ear. But the fracas was dispersed, and the direct altercation between Mr. Bethel and Mr. Evra continued verbally, with Mr. Bethel shouting abuse at Mr. Evra and Mr. Evra shouting back. When Mr. Evra got 15 to 20 yards away, Mr. Bethel said something and Mr. Evra broke free of whoever was restraining him and ran back to confront Mr. Bethel. As Mr. Evra approached, Mr. Bethel adopted a stance with his left hand held up flat in front and his right hand held back in a position ready to punch. Mr. Bethel said that was him taking up a defensive position. And there you go, a famous photograph. If Mr. Evra touched or got past the front hand, he was going to deck Mr. Evra. A truly memorable image. Mr. Bethel did in fact take a swing, but happily missed. It was after the first altercation between Mr. Bethel and Mr. Evra that Mr. Bethel is alleged to have shouted, "I'll effing have you, you effing immigrant," an allegation the groundsman vehemently denied. Now, Mr. Evra, who was about 4 yards away, never heard that, never made any complaint of racist abuse at all, ever, in any interview on Canal Plus, anywhere else, or in his witness statement. But the two witnesses who said they did hear the words, were the first team coach, Mr. Mike Phelan, and the goalkeeping coach, Richard Hartis. The panel said that there was, quote, some confusion and inconsistency in their placing of the alleged racist insult. We should not have expected complete, detailed accuracy and consistency in recollections of a fast-moving, disorderly series of events. However, there are aspects of the evidence of Messrs. Phelan and Hartis which raise serious questions about the reliability of their claims about the racist remark. The panel went on. The inconsistencies in Mr. Phelan's evidence about the sequence of events are not just the normal expected uncertainty about detail, they cast serious doubt on the reliability of their overall evidence. If Phelan and Hartis are right, then in the first place, it's surprising that Mr. Evra didn't hear the remark. According to Mr. Hartis's evidence, Mr. Bethel and Mr. Evra were 4 yards apart when the remark was made. If it was made specifically directed at Mr. Evra. And although English is not his first language, and when he gave evidence it was apparent his own spoken English is far from fluent, Mr. Evra didn't hear the remark. According to Mr. Phelan's and Mr. Hartis's timing of the remark, Mr. Evra would have been standing facing Mr. Bethel when Mr. Bethel directed the remark. Mr. Phelan and Mr. Hartis both say they were 6 meters away from Mr. Bethel, but the commission concluded that the racist remark was not made. So you can actually persuade FA tribunals of innocence in relation to aggravated breaches, although that is a historic case. Now, before we, last things from me, I can see the smile, Jimmy. It's a hat trick you will have all heard. Well, that was Jimmy scoring against Spurs at Stamford Bridge. It's the perfect hat trick, left foot, right foot and a header. Those goals were scored on Wednesday, the 13th of March, 2002. I remember it very well because on Tuesday, the 12th of March, I went with Jimmy to Soho to appeal a red card that he had received in the Worthington Cup final the previous week. And he got a 3-game ban and we won his appeal. As a thank you, Jimmy, knowing I'm a fanatical Spurs fan, got me a ticket and scored a hat trick for me. And I'm very, very grateful because he's never let me forget it. It was a very enjoyable evening. Chris, have you been finding any questions as we go along?
Yeah, some really excellent questions. One of them was, do you feel, Jimmy, that the issues of player abuse are more prevalent in lower leagues than the Premier League?
No, I don't think so. I think it happens all over. I think it happens more in the, well, as far as I know, because the coverage is more in the Premier League. Yeah. I think the how people take the abuse is the same on a higher level or on a lower level. You know, it is not nice wherever you play. But I do think that it's happening more in the higher leagues. I'm manager at Burton. I have not heard previously that there was abuse. I've had problem with one player, and that was really before my time, and it went through in the last 4 months that I've now been a manager at Burton. But there's been one player, and believe you me, it's one too many, you know. But it happens. I feel that it happens more higher up.
Yeah. The Premier League are going to consider at the conclusion of this season whether or not players should continue to take the knee next season. What's your view of whether or not it should continue?
This is actually a very good subject, because I've asked my players what they wanted to do a few weeks ago. If they still wanted to take the knee, or has the effect gone? And some said, no, we want to take the knee, and some said, we don't want to take the knee. So we end up doing still as a collective to stand together, taking the knee. But I personally think we have done that. What are we going to do next to attack the point? The symbol was there, taking the knee and making people aware. Now we have to attack it and take that element out of the game or the society even more, you know? What are we prepared to do for that, you know? And that's where we need to concentrate on. Taking the knee, taking the knee, taking the knee, yes. We get reminded why we are taking a knee. But we need to come with a solution, you know, to better it.
Yeah. And we've had a question, Jim, for you. If the punishment for online racial abuse was that the author and their message or messages would be on a public register for a period of several years that prospective employers could search for, Jim, do you think that would be a sufficient alternative deterrent?
I think that's a very good idea as part of a package of remedies. It's why you hear John Barnes and others talking about the importance of education, because a 16-year-old kid who says something stupid that he doesn't really mean, if he paused to think about it, he wouldn't do it. He shouldn't carry that for the rest of his life and be unable to work because he said something in anger. I think each case needs to be looked at separately, and perhaps a register that you could get off that register if you've done community service or done an education course. So if a player sends an unwise tweet, he'll have to do an education course. He's not going to lose his job, or very unlikely to lose his job. But it's going to depend as part of a package. If a player is abused by one person persistently and consistently and threatened, then you should stay on that register for a long time. I think it would be a very useful part of the package of punishment. But you've got to give people the chance to get off it. And that's what always really impressed me. Whenever you hear John Barnes interviewed, and whenever Ken Chapman spoke about it all those years ago, always talked about the importance of not throwing a kid away, not leaving a kid with no hope. Jimmy, what do you say about that?
I think you're right, but I think we need to go even further. I think those platforms, they know exactly where they go on, what provider, what IP addresses they have. And I think if they really want to do something, and they should take that individual off so that they can't tweet or go on Instagram for a long time. If it is a kid of 16, I do think you're right. You have to give him a chance to redeem himself again, you know, and give him a chance again. But if it occurs again, he needs to get a bigger punishment, you know. And there is a simple rule: 3 strikes and you're done, you know. I think the punishments have to be significantly bigger, otherwise it is going to keep on happening. It's going to keep on happening.
Another question we've had on the thread is, do you think social media boycotts, as the one we saw recently, are an effective means of combating racial abuse on social media? Jimmy, did you feel that it was an effective thing that was done, not last weekend, the weekend before?
It was a start. It's a start. I'm happy that it was done. And I'm happy that the social media platforms, they see that like the sports are not happy with what are going on and that they are not doing enough. I do think if they don't do something significant about it, then we need to do it for a longer period. A weekend, 2 days, 3 days, was good for the first time. I am somebody who can live without the social media. A lot of people can't, but I do think that it is a good start. But it is a good start. Now we need to monitor it. What are the big bosses going to do? As I just said, it's easy to find out somebody's IPO addresses and all them kind of stuff. It is very easy to control it. And yes, they might come on with a different name, but it is one household, so the IP address, that, so that should be banned as well, so that they can't go on a different name and all that kind of stuff. I don't think that it is a difficult thing to do.
Yeah. Jim, do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I made the point that if the social media companies made people give proof of identity and verify their identity, then they wouldn't be able to get away with this. And then if one strike, if you're young, 2 strikes, whatever it's going to be, prove who you are. And once we can prove who these people are who are posting this filth, they can be kicked off. Why should poor old son be subject to anonymous abuse, which no one can track down? I mean, the Premier League and Manchester United work really hard to find 6 people, but there's lots of others out there who use false names. They should not be given the platform. If you can't, you have to provide ID for nearly everything in life. Why not for a social media account?
Yeah.
Do you think, Jimmy, another question we've had is, what's your opinion about the effectiveness of players walking off the pitch following racist behaviour during the game?
I can understand that, but what about the good fans? What about the fans that are conducting themselves right? They don't deserve to see their team walking off the pitch. I think the good fans can police that, what is going on, and really fight that and point them out. How about when the good fans and all the good fans pointing that section out and kicking them out instead of footballers walking off? What about if you get racial abuse from the crowd? Why not kicking them out? And until they are kicked out, the match doesn't go on. These kind of things has to be happening. We shouldn't have to come to the point that players have to walk off. I think the good fans and the fans who come to the game to support their team in the right way, who are ready to scream and sing and give the opponent abuse in the right way, and make it hostile for the opposition in the right way, they need to police the others who are giving the racial abuse.
Jimmy, do you think, another question we've had on the thread is, do you think that those who work within football are involved or consulted enough on what actions should be taken to counter discrimination? Do you think there's engagement between the governing body and those involved in the game?
Not enough. I think it can be even taken further to the government, to the parliament. I think it affects everybody. We are talking about football now, but in a way, it affects everybody. A lot more can be done, and a lot more communication should be having. I don't think that it is very difficult to tackle. You just don't stand for it and you tackle it.
Jim, what's your view about engagement between bodies and participants within the sport?
Well, I don't know because I don't actually work in a football team. I know that the PFA, from speaking to friends and people I've met at the PFA, are constantly trying to get involved with government. I think sometimes there is a breakdown in communication between the FA as a governing body and players. I know, I don't know if you're on the call, Tarek. I know I would exempt you from that. And Tarek Shamel from the FA, who was registered, he is always out there busying himself trying to get participants' point of view. But he is something of a noble exception. There are a lot of people who are not very good at doing anything other than enforcing rather than learning from the other point of view. See Jimmy nodding in agreement there.
Yeah, it's true.
And of course, the problem with government is government of whatever stripe are going to love the opportunity to look good and go down to a Premier League ground and pretend to be working hard to solve racism. They may genuinely want to look as if that's what they're doing, but it's forgotten when the next big thing comes along. Jimmy's right. There needs to be zero tolerance. We need to get tough. We need to get out there and educate people.
Jim, sorry to interrupt you. What I don't understand, and it was beautiful to see a couple of weeks ago that everybody came together when these 7 big clubs or 6, whatever they were trying to get away from our leagues and wanted their own league and making so much money and forgetting about all the fans. Yeah, forgetting about all the fans, forgetting about really the heart of the clubs, really forgetting about it. But everybody came together beautifully and rightly so. Yeah. Now, I think, you know, black or white, racism was not an issue, yeah, but it came together, you know, arm in arm, in the same way, they saw the same way, yeah. Why can we not do that with racism? Why
I couldn't agree with you more, Jimmy.
What is the difference here, you know? What is the difference, you know? That's what I don't understand. It was beautiful to see, and I was really proud of being an ex-footballer and being a manager, and that everybody came together for the same way. Why can we not do that with racism? Whatever form I'm talking about racism, and I'm not only talking about black, I'm not talking about only the color of your skin, I'm talking all racism at the moment we're talking about football, you know? That's what I'm, you know, can't understand.
Couldn't agree with you more. I know that you don't do a lot of social media, but I made this observation 2 weeks ago on LinkedIn that fans killed the ESL in 48 hours. Why the heck can't the fans get out there and stop racism dead in its tracks?
Yeah.
Do you feel, Jimmy, that football has a more persistent problem with racism as compared to other sports? And if so, why do you think that's the case?
I can't tell you that. I can't really give you a comment. I can only give you a comment what is happening in football. I'm not living in rugby or in cricket or, you know, in other sports. They might say there is still racism in their sport. I'll be surprised if there is not. And that's really sad, you know, that I have to say that. But look, football is the most watched sport in the world. You know, it's the national sport here. It is the national sport back home where I was brought up in Holland. You know, so it's the most watched sport. So if we can get it right with football, I think the others will follow, you know, but I think we need to do a lot more And I don't think it's very difficult. It's not difficult, you know, to camp it out. It's not difficult.
Well, everybody, Jimmy, we promised we'd only take an hour of your time, and it's been 70 minutes. Can I just thank you on behalf of everybody? Can I thank you on behalf of everybody? Then let's hope that things continue to improve. Thanks to all of you who've attended. We've had people from the USA, the Caribbean, Spain, France, Switzerland, and there's even a Burnley fan on the link. So
were there some
all over
Spurs
the place.
fans?
Sorry?
Were there some Spurs fans?
There's at least one, Jimmy.
Okay, good.
Thank you so much for your time.
Okay.
I really appreciate it. And we could have talked all night, but that's not fair to you. You've got other things to do.
Thank you, mate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Good seeing you. Thank you.
I hope you've all enjoyed it. And we're going to sign off on that note, everybody. Chris, say goodbye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.